Greetings everyone, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today we're going to be doing another top 10 list video of sorts. I'm going to call this 10 comic book nostalgia reads. I thought about this topic after talking to some of the other organic price books, comic book YouTuber guys, and I just thought it would be a really great subject for a video. Basically, these are 10 books that for whatever reason feel very nostalgic to me. Many of these titles are books I read right when I started to get into comic books. I can't wait to share my list with you, but before I do want to shout out the channel sponsor, organicpricebooks.com. If you're interested in picking up your own comic book collected editions, I highly encourage you to check out their website. You can find a link for it in the video description. And if you see anything you like, you can even use my discount code at checkout, TheComicBookReport, to receive $2 off of your order. Please note if you do make a purchase using my affiliate link or code, I will earn a small commission, but honestly, it's a great way to support this channel. Thank you so much for considering. Now let's get started with the nostalgia list. First on my list, in no particular order, we're going to be talking about Daredevil, Guardian Devil by Kevin Smith and Joe Quesada. This is kicking off the Marvel Knights era for Daredevil. Starts with a brand new #1. This brings us through the David Mack stuff, eventually Bendis, Brubaker, Wade, all sorts of great runs that kick off right here in the Guardian Devil story arc. For me, this is a heavily nostalgia read. I had dabbled in some Daredevil comics before reading this. I believe I read some of his early Silver Age stuff with Stan Lee. I think I read some of the Frank Millar as well. But this was a more modern run when I first started jumping into comics. I was able to pick up this collected edition. It was an issue 1. And from here on out, I was absolutely hooked. I burned through this in chronological order, going all the way, I think, through Shadowland. I think after that was actually when they started a new volume 1 with Mark Waid. At any rate, this is a heavily nostalgia read for me. This book even has a introduction by Ben Affleck, who was Daredevil at the time in that early 2000s Daredevil movie. Anyway, this is a really, really great read. Quesada on artwork in just a really intensive best, I think. I really loved Quesada's art throughout this. Kevin Smith is a comic book writer I am a fan of. I enjoyed what he did with Batman. I enjoyed what he did with Green Arrow. And I definitely enjoyed this run here, Guardian Devil. It's a really fun refresh for the character. There is kind of some spiritual or mythical kinds of ideas, at least by appearance, throughout this run. Lots of great plot twists, turns, things like that. Some heavy stakes for a couple key characters in the Daredevil mythos. It's a fantastic place to start for new readers, and I think it's a real treat for returning Daredevil fans as well. At any rate, when I see this title, I do think about that early period when I was first really finding who are my favorite characters, my favorite creators, and just really getting into comics. I do think of Guardian Devil. Next on my list, maybe an unusual pick, but Marvel 1602 by Neil Gaiman. For me, this was one of my first bigger Marvel mini-series or kind of little event books. I had never really read anything like this, and I think about an early time in my comic book reading when I think about this series. I did review this on the channel some time ago, but essentially it is a little event. It's a Marvel mini-series that it kind of asks the question, what if the dawn of the Marvel Universe, instead of happening in like the 50s, 60s, happened in the early 1600s in America? This kind of pre-colonial period. What happens if the Marvel Universe just was born then? With similar faces, similar characters, similar abilities, but having that kind of older school feel. Neil Gaiman delivers a really fantastical story here. His writing, as always, is lyrical and beautiful. You can almost think of this as like an extended what-if storyline, but honestly, there's so many great bits here. I love how he managed to shoehorn in so many of the great Marvel heroes and villains into these few short issues. I think this book was actually really well paced and one of my favorite comics from Gaiman. I've read some Sandman as well. Obviously, that's an undisputed classic. But this one, I feel like less people talk about these days. There's probably a whole new generation of comic book fans that have maybe never had an opportunity to pick this up. I do encourage it. I think it's a great book. If you're a fan of the Marvel Universe or Neil Gaiman as a writer, I do think that this is one that should not be missed. The artwork throughout as well is very beautiful. It has this kind of painted look, I feel. feel, and it just fits the subject matter, the tone exceptionally well. I particularly liked how he handled some of my favorite characters like Daredevil or Spider-Man. I think the X-Men actually were a pretty cool facet of this Marvel 1602 story. There were a couple other spin-off 1602 titles that were in this universe, not written by Neil Gaiman, but this is the central event. This is all you really need, the main miniseries here, and honestly, it's a good one, and it's one I think about often when I think about the earlier period when I was first getting into comics. Next up today on the list, we're going to be talking about Morning Glories by Nick Spencer and Joe Yzma. So this book, I also think about that period. I was back in college. This would have been probably 2012, give or take. It's when I first really started to get into comic books for myself. They weren't just my dad's old issues. They weren't like the cartoon animated series or some of the couple movies I saw. No, this was me really getting into comic book collected editions, and I just started making a few comic book friends that recommended books to me over there in college, and I never really read any indie titles, not really. I was always a fan of the big two with Marvel and DC, but my friend came in with the first trade paperback of this title, Morning Glories, from Image Comics, and I was interested. I didn't know what to expect for it, and I read the first few issues and was completely hooked. I've been a fan of the show Lost, which is all about asking these questions, so many of these twists and turns, mysteries, action, and this to me is a comic book equivalent. I asked some of the similar questions. It's about all of these kind of dysfunctional kids that go to this faraway, prestigious boarding school, only to find out that there's so many sci-fi, fantasy, horror elements and crazy things happening at this school. We don't really know what's going on. Is there time travel? Is there monsters? Is there super science? Like, what is really happening behind the scenes? What's going on with all these other students? Well, that's the central mystery here, and honestly, from issue 1, I was completely gripped by this series. I did review this first deluxe edition on the channel. Unfortunately, the only caveat I have about this series is that it's been on indefinite hiatus for some time. Spencer and Yzma called it quits. Maybe, I don't know, 50 issues, 40 issues or so, give or take. I haven't looked it up in a while. No word as far as I've heard when they hope to pick this back up again. I think because of that, a lot of people don't want to invest in this series, but honestly, what they've released so far, it's just such a fun ride. I think about the early days of comics for me. This was one of the first indie titles I ever heard of, and to this day, I still think it holds up. Not enough people talk about it, and I'm really hoping that people can generate interest and that these creators come back to finish this incredible series. Next up on our list today, I'm going to be looking at this omnibus, Superman, The Death and Return of Superman Omnibus. Yes, this collects the death of Superman, and primarily that's what I want to talk to here. Being a child of the 90s, I remember that this comic book event, this comic book arc, was just in the zeitgeist. This was such a popular issue in a time where no one could believe they were killing off Superman. And even though I didn't read the comic when it first came out, I do remember this culturally throughout the 90s. People talking about this arc. And so it wasn't until, again, when I was in early college that I started to pick up these stories for myself. I had an old Superman trade paperback, I might still have it, that has the death of Superman. To have it these days in this beautiful omnibus edition, and to have the period, the funeral for a friend, World Without a Superman, Rise of the Supermen, that whole Reign of the Supermen, to have all those arcs included in this omnibus, well, this is just such a treat. Not only do I remember this fondly and nostalgically from growing up in the 90s, but it was also one of the first comics I tried to seek out to read, because culturally I've always been a Superman fan, and I know this is one of the prolific stories that happened in my era. So anyway, I read this earlier on in my comic collecting career, and I still think about it often. I was so happy this past year that I had an opportunity to get this omnibus. Again, flipping through it, I get all sorts of nostalgic. The early 90s artwork is just so gripping. The coloring here just jumps right off the page, and frankly, this is a story that I think every major comic book fan, particularly DC Comics fan, owes it to themselves to read. It is such a great Superman story. It's something that's so thought-provoking, engaging, and just fascinating that DC did this. Definitely a nostalgia read for me. And hey, if you're watching this video and you have yet to subscribe to the channel, I just want to encourage you to do so. I'm always doing top 10 lists, comic book reviews, sometimes hauls, unboxings, different videos like that. Anyway, thank you for considering. Now let's get on with today's list. Next pick for my nostalgia reads, I'm going to be talking about Batman by Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo. Right here I have the first omnibus volume. It's a set of 2 omnibuses that include their full run on Batman. This is at the dawn of the New 52, which was a soft reboot over at DC Comics for those unfamiliar with it. And when I started to collect comics, this era of DC was just starting. I know because this messed with a long-standing continuity, a lot of longer-time DC fans have had an issue with the New 52. Not everyone though, but I know it definitely ruffled some feathers at the time. But for someone like me who was just getting into comic books, it was such an accessible way to jump into some of these mainstream DC comics. And honestly, there was no better run in the New 52 for me than Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's Batman. I love it. It kicked off with the Court of Owls, and from issue 1, I was absolutely hooked. I was enthralled. I could not wait to read more. I had those early standard size hardcover collections for the full run before upgrading here to the omnibus editions last year. But I always think about this fondly because these were kind of an example of collections that were just coming out right when I was getting into comics. So I sought out those collected editions right when there were enough issues to make collected editions. And I was just following the ride. With every new release, I would try to pick up the next volume, and it gave me that sensation of following an ongoing title. No, I never really got into collecting the single issues or anything like that, but for me, following the collected editions was just as good. I loved feeling like I had my hand on the pulse of what was going on at one of the major publishers, and again, the New 52 was just so accessible to new readers like me. Culturally aware of Batman, I'd read some of his earlier Silver Age stuff and a couple other stories here and there, but this was my run. This was my first really ongoing Batman title I tried to seek out as it was happening, and to this day, it's one of my all-time favorites. I think so fondly and nostalgically about this run. My first review video on this channel was even reviewing the Court of Owls. I love it that much. I had to include it on today's list. Next up on my Nostalgia Reads list, I'm going to be talking about the Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus Volume 1. And in case you can't tell already, this is a much older printing than the modern printings we got, I believe, last year. But this is one of my first, if not my very first omnibus edition I ever got. I love this book. It has the first, I think, 50 issues of the Amazing Spider-Man. We have, the Amazing Fantasy issue as well, the part with Spider-Man. Maybe it's 49 issues. I don't know. It's like around 50 issues in this omnibus, but honestly, we have so many foundationally great issues of Spider-Man. Spider-Man growing up was one of my all-time favorite heroes, and to read these issues, I read some of them in black and white in the old Marvel Essentials line. It was a really kind of cheaply reproduced black and white print of some of the early Silver Age comics. I bought a bunch of them, some of them used, some of them I had to glue back together, but they were just these cheaply made black and white prints, but it was the only way at the time I could get my hands on these early issues. And when I first started getting into comics, I really wanted to start with the comic book origins, so I was reading a ton of Silver Age comics, and that was the only way I had to do it. Eventually, when I had enough money and they released these omnibuses, I couldn't wait to get Amazing Spider-Man, and I have not regretted it since. Honestly, these issues in the early Stan Lee, Steve Ditko era of Spider-Man are some of the character's best. I think they hold up with the test of time here, and honestly, this and Stan Lee Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four are my top of the heap, top tier Silver Age comic titles. To this day, I can still go back, read these issues, and thoroughly enjoy it. Even early on, we have the establishment of so many of his rogues gallery of villains. We have all the mechanics that make Peter Parker's Spider-Man fantastic, and honestly, it just works. I cannot think about this comic without getting extremely nostalgic. My first omnibus, one of the first runs I really tried to get into and read all the way through cover to cover where I could, and going all the way back to the Silver Age, it just had that classic comic book feel. It's absolutely a nostalgia read for me, a comfort read, and a run that I still love to this day. Keeping this Silver Age train moving, now I'm going to be talking about Fantastic Four Omnibus Volume 1. This is by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Easily one of the most prolific comic book titles of all time, easily one of my favorite Silver Age title books. This was another series that early on I got in those Marvel Essential editions, the old black and white, really crummy reprints, but I really collected these because I wanted to read all of these old stories. I know that this was one of Stan Lee's earliest claims to fame over at Marvel. This really changed the script and totally revolutionized the superhero comic book world, and honestly, it's still hard to beat. I think it's so fresh. To have a comic book team that was not only a team, but kind of a dysfunctional family, it just made these characters so much more grounded for this age of comics. Again, back in the Silver Age. These were just an early set of comics I really tried to get into and just learn more about this family of characters. I really loved it. I was so happy to get this omnibus when I had the opportunity to. This is another much older reprint of this omnibus. It's an older format, but honestly, it's still holding up quite nicely, and I love revisiting these stories. I do think I reviewed this omnibus sometime last year on the channel, but yeah, just a really great book here. We, of course, have this foursome flying into space, getting bombarded by cosmic rays, only to come back home to Earth with these new abilities. Mr. Fantastic, he can stretch. Invisible Girl at the time, Sue Storm, could turn invisible. This is even before she could do force field powers. We have the Thing, who became Benjamin Grimm, who became this big monster. And of course, Johnny Storm, the Human Torch. Even just flipping through these issues, this is such a time capsule to a time and place in American culture, and I could just easily see how this could really shift the pace of the comic book industry. I know there was nothing quite like this at the time, and honestly, these issues, like Amazing Spider-Man, I think really still hold up today. If you only read modern comic books, I would encourage you, if you ever want to try out Silver Age, Amazing Spider-Man and Fantastic Four, easily top of my list, and to me, will always be a nostalgia read. Next on the list today, we're going to be talking about The Ultimates by Mark Millar and Bryan Hitch. I have the omnibus here. I believe I reviewed this on the channel not too long ago, but this has the entire run from these two creators, and to me, this is definitely a nostalgia read. This book is set in the Ultimate Marvel universe, so not in the mainstream Marvel 616 universe. Why this is important is because at the time, Marvel Comics was trying this whole separate universe to basically modernize a lot of its comic book properties, and while honoring some of the legacy for longtime comic book fans, this was a way to get an issue 1, get in at the ground floor, not needing to know anything about these characters, and just really dive in fresh to a comic book run. Because of that, I think so many of the Ultimate Marvel Comics lines were so accessible to new readers, similar to what DC did with New 52. In the same way, it was catered to newer readers, probably first and foremost. With that being said, I think that both of these creators are so immensely talented, and this was a fantastic way to jump into the just main Avengers characters. This was one of my first big Avengers books that had me absolutely hooked. I do know in this universe they're called the Ultimates, not the Avengers, but let's face it, this is an Avengers title, and it's brilliant. I also think if you're a fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the MCU, that whole film franchise, it got so much of its inspiration clearly from the Ultimates here from Millar and Hitch. If you've never read this, I think you owe it to yourself, especially if you're an MCU fan. I will say that this is a little time capsule-y as well in that early 2000s period. There are a couple pop culture references or slang or way people talk that is a little bit just dated or politically incorrect possibly, but I still think that this series really holds up. This omnibus I'm flipping through is really broken into two major story arcs, and so you can read it all at once, but there are two really big defined 12 or so issue stories in this omnibus, but it's a great read, and I love this omnibus. I love the oversized format. It's a great way to experience this title, but for me, like I said, this was my gateway into Avengers, and this was easily a nostalgia read for me. And speaking of the Ultimate Universe over at Marvel, I can't talk about it without talking about Ultimate Spider-Man by Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley. This is one of my favorite Spider-Man comic runs of all time. Set in that Ultimate Universe, it begins with its own issue 1, and it really just blew people's mind because instead of having just a couple issue origin for Spider-Man, we had, I believe, a 6-issue story arc that was all that Peter Parker origin story where he gets bitten by the radioactive radioactive spider, or in this case it was like genetically altered experimental spider. Anyway, we have him turning into Spider-Man, losing Uncle Ben, all of these different elements that are so familiar culturally and comic book wise to fans everywhere. But we have that spread across 6 issues where we get so much more character depth and nuance. I just really loved it. I was hooked from the first issue. This whole run, I think, is 120 or 150 issues. I'm not really even sure anymore. But it really feels like a defined beginning, middle, and end as far as I'm concerned, this entire Bryan Michael Bendis run. I know Mark Bagley was on it for most of that as well. It's just a really great way to experience Spider-Man. Again, this is not the 616 universe. This is an Ultimate universe, so it is a different Peter Parker. But it feels a little more fresh. Again, this came out in the earlier 2000s, so they kind of tried to modernize the origin, the characters, but even now it feels a little bit dated, I suppose, with some of the language choices and things going on. But I love it. To me, this is one of my definitive Spider-Man books, and I know I'm not alone in that opinion. To see what Bendis and Bagley did throughout this run as well, not only honoring like legacy characters and really popular, prolific story arcs from the grand, decades-long history of Spider-Man, but also spinning things in their own new and fresh way, I just think it was really compelling. I also love the love story between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. I just think it's really beautifully done in Ultimate Spider-Man. This is also a high school age Spider-Man yet again, but it all just really works. I think that we get so much more attention to character, and this is a run that I think has withstood the test of time, and to me, it's definitely a nostalgia read, without a doubt. And last but certainly not least on my top 10 nostalgia reads list here today, we have The Astonishing X-Men by Joss Whedon and John Cassaday. For the purposes of this video, we are looking at the Omnibus edition that has the entire run. To me, this is in a similar camp as Morning Glories. At the time, I was just starting to get into comic books. Some of the friends that actually got me into collecting my own let me borrow a collection of Astonishing X-Men. And honestly, it was a great way to experience X-Men. I think for me, this is one of the more accessible areas that you can jump into X-Men. For those that maybe aren't familiar with X-Men comics, in my mind, they're one of the most convoluted of superhero storytellings in the way that it can be super hard to find a way to jump into these decades-long continuity of characters, because there's just so many different characters, subplots, adjacent X-Men books or X-books, that it can just be really daunting and overwhelming. And even with Astonishing X-Men, it does really take place at a certain time and place in the X-Men universe. This one in particular takes place after Grant Morrison's era on New X-Men, but it is accessible and perfectly palatable for new readers or prospective readers who want to get into the mutant books. One of the things I liked about this omnibus that you saw as I was just flipping into it was it gave you a kind of previously on X-Men, and it gave you kind of story bits that were relevant for this title, and it really brings you up to speed. This is a really great book with a really fun X-Men team. We have Cyclops, Wolverine, the Beast, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, Emma Frost, to name a few, but just a really beautiful book. John Cassaday on artwork. It's just really spellbinding, interesting. I think the art is absolutely gorgeous. My only detriment about this book is that I think that they could have had Wolverine live up to an even greater potential, but overall, still a great team book. I love the storylines. It really holds up, and again, I first read some of these issues when a friend loaned me a copy of his collection, and it's really stayed with me. I'm so happy to have the omnibus, and I think about these stories fondly, remembering that time, like I said, when I first started to get into comic books for myself. A great nostalgia read for me, and a great general read for any X-Men fan out there. And that's going to round out our list of 10 comic book nostalgia reads from me, Dominic, here at the Comic Book Report. I did this video not only to stroll down memory lane and talk about a couple of the comic books that really made me a comic book fan back when I first started reading over a decade ago now, but I also made this video because I want to hear from you. What are some comic books you would consider nostalgia reads? And what I mean by that are, what are maybe some of the issues or collections that you first started reading when you were just getting into the comic book hobby? I know in the scope of things, I might still be a newer comic book fan or reader. There's some of you that have lapped me by decades in how long you've enjoyed comics. But for you, what are your favorite comic book nostalgia reads? What are those that bring you all the way back to when you first started to to enjoy this medium? I'd love to hear about that in the comments below. If you don't have nostalgia reads, maybe recommend some of your favorite books for brand new comic book readers. I definitely want to cater to those who are just getting into the hobby. I would love the comments to be a great recommendation list and just a stroll down memory lane for perhaps all of you. I'd love to hear your nostalgia reads, your recommendations for new readers, what you think about this video, or anything else. I always love hearing from you guys in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to leave this video a like, maybe that comment we talked about, and maybe share the video with a friend or watch one of my others. Thank you so much, and have a good one.